You're watching Scriptease. In today's episode, we'll be examining the 3-act structure using Total Recall as an example. You can expect spoilers for the whole film, mature language, and graphic imagery. Oh, and by the way, stick around to the end to find out more about the Patreon page I just started up for Scriptease. Thanks. Okay, I know, breaking down the 3-act structure has been done to death. There's a million blog posts, YouTube videos, online courses, books, and Reddit threads on the topic. Do I have anything more to add to the discussion? Honestly, no. But you know what? I had to cover the topic here on Scriptease, since it is such a fundamental framework for storytelling, especially in the Hollywood studio system. Each different angle and new example strengthens the lessons of the 3-act structure in your mind. So with that self-aware disclaimer out of the way, let's get to the meat of the topic. The 3-act structure is one way to format the beats of your story. It's a very conventional Western storytelling structure, which gives it the pros of mass appeal and easy comprehension. A viewer will feel comfortable with a movie told using the 3-act structure. Of course, the big con then is that being so conventional can bore more experienced moviegoers. Adhering too strictly to the 3-act structure means predictability, anathema to the audience who wants to be surprised. That's not to say that a story with the 3-act structure can't have twists and turns, just that it's that teensy bit harder. Total Recall is a perfect example of a film that capitalizes on the pros of 3-act structure. By using a simple plot structure, the gags, gore, action, and sex appeal of the film are allowed to flaunt their brilliance. Of course, that's not to say that Total Recall is without substance. There's a strong theme of dreams and warped reality. Our protagonist, Quaid, has a clear need to define his identity, and there are plenty of clever twists that keep the audience guessing. Let's step through the screenplay and look at how Total Recall hits every beat of the 3-act structure. Act 1 is the setup for the story, where you establish the what, when, and where. The when and where will stem from your story's world. Is it the past, present, or future? Or maybe it's an alternate reality or a fantasy world. Of course, you can get more specific. What country or city are you in? Maybe it's just a single borough of New York City. Or maybe it's a remote desert island. The world will also key into the genre. If we're watching a comedy, we expect something funny right off the bat. An action film will probably open with an action-packed set piece. Most importantly, the first act needs to establish the protagonist's status quo. What is their life like before the story begins? Essentially, the first act takes a protagonist whose life is stable but imperfect, and then introduces a disruption which forces them to take action and change. Total Recall is a science fiction film set in a future in which Mars has been colonized and technology allows for memories to be altered. The film puts a strong hook up front where our protagonist, Douglas Quaid, has a dream of being on Mars, in which he falls and suffers an excruciating death from depressurization. While I'm not typically a fan of dream sequences, Total Recall gets away with it because the film is about dreams and false realities. Using that as a justification, this hook perfectly sets up the atmospheric issues of Mars and Quaid's love interest Melina, while also making a promise to the audience that we'll get to see more of this strange alien planet. The sexual intrigue with Laurie then pulls us through the establishing pages of the script, learning about the rebels on Mars. Yeah, it's not exactly subtle, but it's effective. We see futuristic TV technology and the large security X-ray scanner too, establishing that as yet uninvented technologies are to be expected in this world. Then we have the inciting incident. The inciting incident is a call to action for the protagonist, an opportunity that presents itself as a break from the status quo. In Total Recall, Quaid sees an ad for Recall, a company that can implant memories of places you've never been to that's marketed as a vacation alternative. Quaid sees a way for him to quench his curiosity for Mars, so he makes the active choice of visiting Recall for himself. Active is crucial here. You want your protagonist to be proactively seeking out adventure as much as possible. The end of Act 1 is demarked by the creatively named Plot Point 1, also called Turning Point 1. You'll hear numerous definitions of this point, but the way I like to think of it is that Turning Point 1 is the point of no return. If the inciting incident was a chance to embark on adventure, Turning Point 1 is the ship setting sail. No going back now. In Total Recall, the obvious choice for Plot Point 1 is when Quaid undergoes the recall treatment and his past memories reawaken, raising a red flag that brings the agency in to kill him. Even if he didn't want to go to Mars, he now has no choice but to flee from his assailants. Alternatively, you could say that when Quaid finds out Laurie isn't really his wife and fights her, this is the point at which he has turned his back on his old life and must strike forward to figure out who he really is. Like I said, the 3-act structure isn't rigid, it's just a guideline. The point is, Quaid can no longer go back to being a construction worker. Act 1 is your chance to define your world. If you introduce something absurd in Act 1, the audience will accept it as a truth of your world. No one blinks an eye when Quaid finds out about Recall's ability to implant memories. But if this idea was suddenly introduced in Act 3, the audience would, understandably, say, wait, what? Point is, take advantage of the audience's suspension of disbelief early on if you want to set up ludicrous story elements. Once you're in Act 2, you're along for the ride. By now, the audience should know the protagonist's goal, and now we're watching them doggedly pursue that goal while overcoming the obstacles in their way. For some reason, everyone I talk to and every article I read says that this is the hardest part of the story to write, but I strongly disagree. This is the most fun part of the film. You've done the legwork of setting up your world, and now you get to play around with the characters and set pieces that can exist inside it, while laying subtle setups for your final act. If your second act feels boring to write, it's probably because your character's goal isn't clear, or your world doesn't have enough personality. And that's a huge issue, since the second act is just over half of your runtime. Act 2 is mainly composed of rising action, where the obstacles presented escalate in terms of stakes and tension. This is your chance to introduce more of the supporting cast and build out their motivations and flaws, while playing them off the protagonist. In Total Recall, the majority of rising action is produced by Richter, an agent of the agency who is intent on killing Quaid. Quaid has to escape him multiple times through car chases, clever thinking, and outside assistance. The film follows a fairly distinct pattern of exposition followed by action. Exposition, Quaid learns Laurie isn't his wife. Action, Quaid is chased on foot by gun-toting agents. Exposition, Quaid learns he's been bugged. Action, Quaid escapes in a Johnny cab. Exposition, Quaid learns who he is from his previous identity Hauser and is told to go to Mars. Action, Quaid's disguise is blown as he's entering Mars, causing a firefight. When you put it like that, it's pretty blatantly formulaic, but the technology in the film, the humor, the practical effects, and the intrigue of Quaid's true identity are entertaining enough to keep you engaged anyway. In the middle of Act 2 is the aptly named midpoint, a key moment that radically escalates the stakes of the situation and throws the protagonist's journey into doubt. I would say of all the points in the three-act structure, the midpoint is the most vague. Sometimes the midpoint is a high moment, in which the protagonist feels close to success, but it's immediately cut short. The pride before the fall, if you will. Other times it's a stumble, which leads the protagonist down a series of poorly motivated decisions. Either way, the midpoint will usually demonstrate that what the protagonist wants isn't what they need, though they don't realize it yet. In Total Recall, Quaid is visited by Dr. Edgemar, who tells him that the journey he's experienced thus far is the result of an aberration with Recall's memory implant procedure. Although Quaid isn't dumb enough to believe him, the suggestion is enough to throw even more doubt on his identity. Is Hauser real, or is he really just Douglas Quaid? He goes forward misguided, wanting to find out if Hauser is real, when what he actually needs is to forge his own identity as Quaid. Act 2 ends with Plot Point 2 or Turning Point 2. This is the lowest point for the protagonist, where all seems lost. Since the midpoint, they've been beaten down, and now their goal feels further away than ever. A lot of writers go too easy on their protagonist, either because they've grown to like them too much, or, worse, they're too lazy to think of a creative way to get their protagonist back out of trouble in Act 3. You really do need to punish the protagonist though. Strip away their help so that they're forced to demonstrate why they're our hero in the first place. In Total Recall, Quaid is betrayed by Benny, who kills Quado, the leader of the revolution. As if that weren't bad enough, he then finds out that his original personality, Hauser, was a double agent. He got what he wanted. He confirmed that Hauser was real, but it didn't give him what he needed. An accompanying moment to Plot Point 2 is what I like to call the moment of reflection. It's a quiet scene in which the protagonist is given the truth they need to succeed, but they're not ready to accept it yet. In Total Recall, Quaid tells Quado that he wants to be himself again, to which Quado responds,
"You are what you do. A man is defined by his action, not his memory."
Quaid takes this lesson on, but he isn't able to fully realize its meaning until after his image of Hauser is destroyed. Essentially, the purpose of the moment of reflection is to give the protagonist the inner strength to pull themselves out of their despair in Plot Point 2. Act 3 is the resolution of the story. It begins with the pre-climax, which may or may not include the moment of reflection. In either case, the protagonist pulls themselves back up, usually using some tools or allies that were set up in Act 1 or 2, and prepares themselves for the climax. In Total Recall, Quaid uses his incredible strength, which has been showcased throughout the movie, to rip free of the memory implant machine and free Melina. He uses the hologram machine that was set up in Act 2 to fight the agency's henchmen, and shows that despite Hauser being evil, he's willing to take new actions as Quaid to save Mars. And that brings us to the all-important climax, the most tense and dramatic moment of your story. All your setups are paid off, every loose end is tied up, and most importantly, the dramatic question is answered. All of this comes together in the form of the protagonist squaring off against the antagonist, whose ideals oppose one another. To truly win, the protagonist has to prove that their newfound belief is correct, and then, by implementing that belief, use action to defeat the antagonist. In Total Recall, Quaid fights Richter before his final confrontation with Cohaagen. Cohaagen was responsible for Quaid's lost identity, using him as an unknowing mole to get to Quado. Apart from being a megalomaniac, Cohaagen also stubbornly refuses to accept that Quaid can be different from Hauser, his old friend. In the climax, Quaid proves him wrong by doing two things Hauser never would have done: killing Cohaagen and rescuing the people of Mars. With the source of conflict banished in the climax, that just leaves the denouement. The denouement is an epilogue of sorts, showing the fallout of the climax. If the protagonist emerged victorious, you see how they've changed for the better, and how the world is better because of their actions. In a tragedy, the scene still shows the fallout of the climax, but it will obviously be filled with more despair. In Total Recall, we see Mars gain an atmosphere, restoring oxygen to the Martians, who are now freed from their dependency on the agency. Quaid also finds peace with his identity, accepting that even if his journey has been a dream, he can still make it into a reality. The three-act structure isn't definitive. It does map onto a lot of great stories, but there are also a bunch of stories I love that don't follow the structure at all. What does matter is being aware of how your story relates to the structure. If your story doesn't establish the protagonist's status quo before launching us into the story, why? Are you afraid the status quo is too boring? Or is there an interesting twist that can only work by excluding the status quo? Will the audience find that too jarring? Of course, that's just one example. Most importantly, the three-act structure is well known. When discussing your story with other people, perhaps even potential investors, you want to be able to relay your story to them in a way you know they'll understand. For that reason, the three-act structure is a common reference point you need in your toolkit. Good writing, and whoa! Just before I finish the video, I'd love to tell you about the new Patreon page for Scriptease. There's a reason why video essay channels usually only upload once a month. Making these videos every fortnight takes a lot of time. But I do it because I love it. I love learning new things about screenwriting and then getting to share it with you guys. In fact, I'd love to keep doing it, and to keep getting better and better, and maybe even upload more frequently in the future. The Patreon page is just one way to make that happen. I've made the rewards about bringing us closer together so I can cover more of the topics that you guys want to see and connect us into one big screenwriting community. If that interests you, you can support Scriptease for as little as $2 a month and nab yourself some pretty sweet rewards too. Check out the Patreon page here if you're interested. Good writing and good luck.